Hello, I'm Andrew Custer, executive editor of the series of critical editions MUSA, Music of the United States of America, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this interview. These interviews are designed to spark curiosity about the cutting edge research of music scholars and bring their work to a wider audience. And today, I'm joined by Renee Norris, professor at Lebanon Valley College, to discuss her new MUSA edition, Opera Parody Songs of Blackface Minstrels, 1844 to 1860, published by AR Editions. Renee, welcome. And I'd like to start by getting into the background of your edition. Could you please give us a very brief summary of minstrelsy in the United States in the early 1800s?
Sure. So minstrelsy started around, sometime during the 1820s. It typically was performed by soloists who typically were, in the 1820s, they were white men who were wearing blackface makeup. They often would appear with like a touring theatrical troupe or in a circus, that kind of venue. Later, by the 1840s, minstrels formed troupes and performed a full evening's, performance of songs and skits and dances, and that's really where my edition begins. I'd also like to mention that from the very beginning, minstrels portrayed people of color in a certain limited way, typically as uneducated, incapable of upward mobility, often as animalistic and grotesque. And so those characteristics of blackface performance existed throughout the existence of the minstrel show. And then the other thing to mention about early minstrelsy, I think, is that many scholars describe minstrelsy's early music as a mixture of European and African American styles. And so it sounded often different from the prevailing song styles of the time. It was strongly articulated, up-tempo, likely used some syncopation. And so it had its sort of own niche in the entertainments of the time as sounding different from the typical songs. So.
Thank you, Renee. Could you tell us, for your edition, why you chose to focus on minstrels' opera parody songs?
Right. So initially, I was just attracted to this apparent incongruity between minstrelsy and opera. I saw them as inhabiting maybe different class structures, opera being more upper class and minstrelsy being more lower class. And that's often how the genres are described in the scholarship and in literature about the early 19th century in the United States. However, as I studied more, I began to see that minstrels used opera parodies to suggest parity or equality with opera. And that they were very intentional about that because they wanted to attract a larger audience to their shows than was, typical of early minstrelsy. So when minstrels began to parody opera in the 1840s, I think it was part of an initiative to establish their sustainability. And to do that particularly by advertising to middle-class families, including women and children, which did work. And I think that one of the contributions of this edition is that it provides evidence for the establishment of minstrelsy as a widespread accepted entertainment by the middle of the 19th century. And then that led to the tenacity of minstrelsy stereotypes, the blackface stereotypes in American culture.
That's very interesting. So that brings us to the sources for your edition. Could you describe what sources you found and how did you choose them, and what were some of the decisions you needed to make when looking at them?
I researched both opera and minstrelsy. Primarily, I was looking at sheet music, and I focused my attention to two large collections, the Library of Congress, and then also the New York Performing Arts Library at Lincoln Center. So sheet music for piano and voice was a significant contributor. Another significant source was songsters. So songsters are small books of song lyrics only. They don't publish music. And a lot of the parodies were published only as a songster lyric. And I think that's probably because publishers assumed that audiences would already have access to or know the operatic melody that the parodied lyric was meant to be set to. So as far as some decisions that I needed to make, a difficulty, and this particular decision actually almost derailed the whole project from the beginning, because sheet music for the minstrel show is, published for piano and voice. It's really the only musical information we have. There are a few other sources like banjo songs, tutors, but the sheet music is not representative of minstrel performance, which happened in theaters. It was typically performed by banjo and fiddle and tambourine and bone castanet. So the instrumentation was completely different from piano and voice. And then the sheet music was arranged and sort of codified, set in stone as a publication, whereas minstrel performance probably was quite improvisatory. So in a sense, we really don't know what minstrel show music sounded like, especially in the early part of the 20th century. The 19th century. So eventually, I decided that even though the sheet music is not representative, it's still quite useful. And it seems likely that minstrels actually did perform operatic melodies on the stage as part of their theatrical performance. And so even though the sheet music was not fully representative, it was representative enough that it could be useful to create an edition like this. And then another decision that you and I worked together on, Andrew, was dating. So most of these publications are not dated, or they're dated incorrectly, especially songsters. And so we came up with some methods for dating undated sources, like looking at publishers' addresses, plate numbers, looking at copyright notices from the Library of Congress, those kinds of things. And so we were able to come up with some date ranges or provisional dates for these scores. And that led to another, I think, significant contribution of this edition, which is that parodies peaked in popularity between 1848 and 1852. So that seems to be a time period when parodies were exceptionally popular. And the parody techniques that we see in those particular songs, which we can get into in just a minute, tend to be based on racist caricature. And so that was the method that was used during this most popular time of the opera parodies. And then after that, there were fewer parody songs published after the mid-1850s. And many of them don't use, the minstrel show dialect, which was kind of a made-up theatrical dialect. It was not representative of African-American vernacular English, even though minstrels purported that it was. But that use of dialect, which was so prevalent until the mid-1850s, seems to be less prevalent after that. And the parodies often will imitate the originals without changing them very much. And so I think we're seeing a change in how minstrelsy conceived of itself as not just focused on blackface caricature, but starting to bring in all kinds of different genres and styles and just performing them as they were originally written rather than changing them.
Yeah, it's really just a fascinating and groundbreaking edition targeting this very interesting time frame of music making. Could you discuss an example in your edition of how you assembled opera parody from all these different sources?
Yeah, so C Sir C is probably one of the most interesting songs in the edition for several reasons. It atypically parodies an entire operatic scene, or what might be known as a double aria, from Bellini's La Sonnambula. So Bellini's La Sonnambula was actually a fairly typical source of minstrel parody. I think it was a very well-liked opera during the time. But what's, again, atypical is that the entire scene is parodied in C Sir C, not just an excerpt, not just part. So to back up a little bit, a lot of Italian opera's scenes are set up in a very predictable way, with an opening recitative and then a slow lyrical section that's called the cantabile, and then there's a transition and a cabaletta. So typically, and the cabaletta is a sort of fast ending section. So typically minstrels would parody only the cantabile, which would be the lyrical section near the beginning, which was often quite well known. But again, so C sur C parodies all of that, and we needed to find musical sources from the operatic repertory that we could set the songster lyric to. And that was challenging because I couldn't find a score for the complete opera that was published before, say, 1860. And one of the methods that I used for the edition is that the operatic model, which was the operatic original, needed to predate the parody so that I could be reasonably sure that the music that I'm presenting in the edition was music that the minstrels would have known about. So we couldn't find that. And so we did find several sources that were helpful. There was a libretto, an English language libretto that was translated by Henry Raleigh Bishop, who was a British composer and arranger who created several English language versions of Italian operas. And then we also found a score for that was housed in the British Library that had a lot of the music from the scene, but not all of it. And the score was Bishop's arrangement. And so using Bishop's score and then another score from the opera that was a little bit later, we were able to sort of cobble together music to set C sur C. The other interesting thing about C sur C is that it uses not only operatic music, but also minstrel show music. So the parodist is identified as Nelson Canese, who is in himself a very interesting character in the story, in that he was a multifaceted performer. He performed in blackface as a minstrel. He also performed outside of blackface as a concert musician, vocal concerts, and he performed in opera. And so I think he knew La Sonnambula quite well. And in his lyric parody from this scene from La Sonnambula, he includes quotes from popular minstrel show songs. One was called Where Do You Come From? And the other was called Lucy Neal. And so it's clear that he was not only expecting singers of this parody, C sur C, to sing operatic music, but to also create this medley of minstrel show music and operatic music. And so, Andrew, you and I worked really closely together to figure out how to put all those different pieces together in an effective representation of what C sur C might have sounded like. And then another thing to mention about C sur C is that it was really popular right at the height of the popularity of minstrel show parodies, so right around 1849. And it uses the typical racist caricature approach that I mentioned earlier. So this sort of made-up minstrel dialect, presenting the operatic characters as uneducated and rural and primitive. So those are very typical techniques that minstrels use to create these caricature parodies.
It's a fascinating edition, and I'm so delighted to have you share some aspects of your work. And congratulations, that's in print. So thank you so much, Renee Norris, for joining us and visiting about your work. Be sure to check out Renee's MUSA edition of opera parody songs of Blackface Minstrels, along with other MUSA editions published by AR Editions. Thank you, Renee.